Britain has a navy, nuclear weapons, intelligence services, colonies, plus a centuries-old reputation as the ruler of the seas. And the United States has paper, the dollar, and a single lever that can shut an empire down faster than any bombing campaign ever could. The Suez Crisis of 1956 is not a story about tanks and a canal. It's a story about how one financial signal from Washington stopped a war in a single day. Today, you'll learn how the United States used Britain's national debt and its post-World War II dependence on foreign currency to force London, in one day, to stop a war, suffer a public humiliation, and finally admit the age of the British Empire was over. Not gradually, not over time, but in the exact moment Washington realized Britain was no longer an equal ally. It was a debtor that could be put in its place with a single move. Here's what that looked like. On November 6, 1956, Britain lost $279 million in reserves in a single week. The pound was collapsing. Washington refused to help. And by noon that day, the British cabinet voted to stop a war they were winning because they couldn't afford to continue. The message was blunt. The United States would not support the pound. By the end of this video, I'll show you the exact moment the British cabinet understood. To continue the operation meant risking a pound crisis this week. You'll see the specific numbers on Anthony Eden's desk, and you'll hear the question that made an empire surrender. But to understand why one call from Washington could stop London, we have to start at the beginning. At the moment, Britain decided the world still played by the old rules. They were wrong, and they had exactly 11 days to find out. July the 26th, 1956, Alexandria, 9 p.m. local time. Gamal Abdel Nasser steps up to the podium before 250,000 Egyptians. The square is humming. He speaks about independence, about dignity, about Egypt no longer being anyone's puppet. And then he says the code word, de laisser, the name of the French engineer who built the canal. That is the signal. In that instant, across Egypt, from Port Said to Suez, everything begins. Egyptian forces move in. Offices are seized. Telecommunications are cut. Foreign employees learn about the nationalization from the radio, after their desks have already been taken over. The British manager of the company, hearing the news, tries to call London. The line is dead. He runs outside and sees Egyptian soldiers at the entrance. "This is illegal," he protested. The Egyptian response was the same everywhere. The old rules no longer applied. In Port Said, British engineers refuse to abandon their posts. They stay at the controls, they keep the canal moving, because they think Egypt cannot run it without them. But they are wrong. Within 24 hours, Egyptian technicians, the same men Europeans had kept in secondary roles, ran the canal flawlessly. British newspapers had predicted chaos. There was none. That silence was louder than any speech. It's a blow not only to economics, but to pride. For decades, Britain and France had lived with the assumption that without them, civilization collapses, that their engineers and administrators are the spine of global infrastructure. Suez proves the opposite in 24 hours. Nasser has calculated everything. The speech is broadcast live. The crowd hears the code word and understands what it means. He isn't just taking a canal, he's taking a symbol, a piece of imperial power, a piece of Europe's illusion. And he chooses de laisser on purpose, the name of the man who built the canal, whose name now becomes the trigger for liberation from Europe. The square erupts. 250,000 people understand. Something has changed. Forever. In London, it's 7 p.m. Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister, receives the message and immediately calls an emergency cabinet meeting. By midnight, there are first drafts of a response plan. Eden is furious. He compares Nasser to Mussolini, to Hitler. He says, if we let him get away with this, the Middle East will follow. The empire will crack. Oil will be at risk. and Britain will be laughed out of the world. He insists they must act now, because later will be too late. He has already seen what later becomes. But there's a problem. Eden has been prime minister for barely a year and a half. He's insecure. He's desperate to prove he can make imperial decisions. This isn't only politics, it's personal. Churchill, already out of office, watches from the shadows. Churchill warned him, "Don't do this without the Americans." Eden smiled. He had waited 15 years in Churchill's shadow. Now it was his moment. He wasn't going to share it with Washington. In Eden's office hangs a map of the British Empire, the kind children once studied in school, read across half the globe, and on that map, the canal is not just a waterway, it is an artery, a thin line holding the whole structure together. Suez is the line beyond which, he believes, the collapse begins. And the numbers confirmed his fear. 2/3 of Europe's oil passed through the canal. And so, the decision is made. What followed would be recorded in a document so dangerous, the British tried to burn it. The next morning, Eden calls Paris. French Prime Minister Guy Mollet answers. France is already furious. Nasser is supporting Algerian rebels. For Paris, he is an enemy. The two men talk not about how to respond, but about when to start the operation. Why this reaction? Here's a number Eden saw every morning. $2.2 billion. That's all Britain had in reserves. 4 months of imports. One crisis away from collapse. And here's what kept him awake. Faith in a currency can die in a single afternoon. All it takes is one question in the markets. Can Britain pay its bills tomorrow? For Britain, Suez wasn't just geography. It was oxygen, the shortest route to oil. And oil in the 1950s wasn't just energy. It was fuel for the army, for industry, and for the very survival of the state. Formally, Britain was still a great power. But after 1945, its reputation rested on a single, fragile pillar: the world's belief in the pound. If Egypt can take a strategic asset, so can Iran, Iraq, anyone. Britain isn't afraid of Nasser. Britain is afraid that the world is no longer afraid of Britain. The men in that cabinet still believed power meant ships and flags. They hadn't learned. Power was already becoming something else: credit, reserves, trust. And Britain was running out of all three. So Britain decides to act in a way that makes the United States, even if irritated, accept it as a fact. They assume America will not let the canal fall into Soviet influence. America needs stability. America needs oil. America is fighting the Cold War. So Washington will grumble, and then it will back them. It's a bet based on the old model of the world. We act, you cover. But in 1956, Britain misses the one thing that matters. The United States is no longer just an ally. It is a creditor. An ally can be offended. A creditor can turn off your oxygen. Britain is confident it knows what it's doing. It doesn't. And in 11 days, one phone call would prove it. In Washington, the mood is not supportive. It is cold, controlled, suspicious. President Dwight Eisenhower is not a romantic about empire. He is a soldier who has seen Europe burn, and he has no interest in watching Britain and France set the Middle East on fire again, especially not with Soviet eyes on every move. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles is even more direct. He tells his staff that if Britain and France try to replay the 19th century, the United States will not be their insurance policy. And yet London and Paris still believe the Americans will fall in line. They tell themselves, Washington will complain publicly, but privately it will understand. So they move from outrage to planning. At first, the goal is simple: force Egypt to reverse nationalization, bring the canal company back under Western control, restore order, restore the old rulebook. But there's a problem, one that every cabinet meeting runs into within minutes. If they invade openly, they look like what they are: colonial powers grabbing back what they lost. So they need a cover story. France has one. France suggests a deal with Israel. Israel has its own reasons: cross-border raids, tensions in Gaza, arms flowing into Egypt, and, above all, the Straits of Tiran, an economic choke point Israel wants opened. Between October 22nd and 24th, 1956, representatives of Britain, France, and Israel met in secret in a suburb of Paris. David Ben-Gurion, Moshe Dayan, and Shimon Peres represented Israel to draft a plan that sounds like diplomatic fiction, but serves as the trigger for war. It becomes known as the Protocol of Sèvres: 3 countries, 1 piece of paper, and a secret so dangerous that the British government will deny its existence for 40 years. The original document? They tried to burn it. Here's the logic. Israel will attack Egypt and advance into the Sinai. Britain and France will issue an ultimatum to both sides: stop fighting and withdraw from the Canal Zone. Egypt will refuse, because Egypt did not start the invasion and has no reason to retreat from its own territory. Britain and France will then intervene to separate the combatants and protect international shipping. On paper, it looks neutral. In reality, it is a pretext to seize the canal, a staged crisis, a scripted ultimatum, a war drafted like a contract. The British Foreign Secretary, Selwyn Lloyd, understands what it is. He is uneasy, but he signs. The French are more eager. For them, Nasser is not only the man who took the canal, he is also the man they believe is fueling rebellion in Algeria. This is personal. This is colonial trauma turning into policy. Israel's leaders calculate too. They are not naive about Britain and France. They know they are being used. But they also know. This is the rare moment when the old European powers are willing to do something Israel wants, and they may never offer it again. So they take the deal. All of this is happening while London continues to speak publicly in the language of diplomacy: negotiations, international control, conferences, legal disputes. Behind the scenes, the operation has a name: Musketeer. And it moves fast, because Eden is convinced time is running out. He imagines Nasser consolidating power, rallying the Arab world, humiliating Britain on the global stage. He imagines the canal becoming a symbol of anti-Western revolt. He imagines the Soviet Union walking into the vacuum with smiles and weapons. So the British cabinet tells itself a comforting story. This will be quick, and the Americans, once the dust settles, will accept it. But Eisenhower and Dulles are not just watching the Middle East. They are watching Europe, and they are watching the calendar. Because 1956 is an election year in the United States. Eisenhower is running for re-election, and the last thing he wants is an American campaign season dominated by images of Western powers invading an Arab country, while Washington is forced to explain why it looks complicit. There is also another crisis unfolding at the exact same time, one that will matter far more to American public opinion and to global credibility: the Soviet crackdown in Hungary. So, from Washington's perspective, the British-French plan is not only morally messy, it is strategically disastrous. If the West condemns Soviet tanks in Budapest, how can it justify Western troops in Egypt? And now, this becomes the core of the American calculation. Britain and France are acting as if they still define the West. But in 1956, the United States is already deciding what the West can afford to be. The plan is signed. The script is written. All that remains is the opening scene, and 7 words that would end an empire. And one man in London, who would later become Prime Minister, was already counting the cost. The war began the way Britain had started wars for centuries: quickly, decisively, with the sense that history was on its side. On October 29, 1956, at 5 p.m. local time, Israel moved into the Sinai. Within hours, Britain and France issued their ultimatum, exactly as planned, exactly as scripted, a crisis engineered to look like an accident. Militarily, The operation moved forward. Bombing began. Paratroopers prepared. The maps on the wall in London were covered in arrows and confident timelines, the familiar language of a campaign in which everything is already decided. But at that exact moment, a different panic began in London. Not among generals. Among the people who don't look at maps. They look at charts. The pound was already standing on trust. Trust Britain could no longer fully buy. The moment the first bombs fell, the financial world read the message behind them. Britain was fighting a major operation against the stated position of the United States, and the market responded instantly. In the first hours of the bombardment, traders in New York began selling pounds. Not because of emotion, because of logic. Because in a dollar-centered system, you do not go against the United States and expect your currency to be treated as safe. By noon, losses reached $30 million. By evening, it was $50 million. The next morning, the Treasury stopped counting in millions. They started counting in hours. In Egypt, British soldiers were winning every battle. In London, Britain was losing the war. Insurance rates on British ships in the Mediterranean tripled. Confidence, the invisible asset holding everything together, started leaking out of the system. And then the energy shock hit. The Suez Canal was blocked, ships sunk to clog it. Syria blew up an oil pipeline. 300,000 barrels per day, gone. Saudi Arabia announced an embargo. 500,000 barrels per day, cut overnight. By November 6th, Britain had lost $279 million, 15% of its total reserves, in just 1 week. In London, gasoline shortages began. The government prepared ration cards, the exact same design as 1945. Someone in the ministry had kept the templates, just in case. Lines formed at petrol stations for the first time in a decade. Drivers argued. People filled whatever containers they had. Some buses cut routes in half because they couldn't be sure they'd have fuel for the return trip. The Ministry of Fuel drafted Plan X, full rationing. A war for oil was producing an oil famine, almost absurd if it weren't so dangerous. In Africa and Asia, colonial leaders were watching. They would remember what happened next. Around the same time, the Soviet Union issued its own threats. Nikita Khrushchev spoke about missiles and retaliation. But in the cabinet, they knew the real threat wasn't coming from Moscow. Eden understood what this meant. If rationing returned, his political career was finished. But if rationing did not return, the reserves would disappear. His government had a scenario for the military, a scenario for diplomacy. But it had no scenario for a financial attack, especially not one coming from a supposed ally. And the United States moved not like an imperial partner, but like a creditor. No fleet, no torpedoes, no dramatic confrontation. Just a simple rule. If you break the system's rules, I turn off your oxygen. U.S. Treasury Secretary George Humphrey called London. One conversation. The message was blunt. The United States would not support the pound. No loans, no IMF approval, no lifeline. End of empire. What happened next took place behind closed doors. November 6, 1956. Morning. 10 Downing Street. What happened in that room is documented in cabinet minutes, declassified decades later. Around the table sit Prime Minister Anthony Eden, Foreign Secretary Selwyn Lloyd, the defense leadership, and Harold Macmillan, Chancellor of the Exchequer. Macmillan places a single sheet of paper on the table. Numbers, currency reserves, the rate of loss, a forecast. Eden looks down, takes off his glasses, rubs the bridge of his nose. Silent. Then one question. How much time do we have? Macmillan answers carefully like a man reading a diagnosis. At this rate, 1 week, maybe 10 days, then the pound breaks. Imports stop. We won't have the currency to pay for food. The room doesn't argue with the math. It argues with reality. Someone insists the operation is succeeding militarily. Port Said is nearly taken. Give us 2 or 3 more days, and the canal is ours. Macmillan lifts his head. In 2 or 3 days, he says, we won't have reserves. Not enough to defend the pound. Not enough to buy oil. Not enough to keep the economy from sliding into panic. He pauses, then delivers the line that ends the war. We can't buy a victory we can't pay for. Eden stares out the window. November rain, gray London. On his desk lies a telegram from the commander in Port Said. Objective nearly secured, awaiting orders. Orders that would never come. Somewhere out there, petrol stations are running dry. And in Egypt, his soldiers were winning a war he could no longer afford. He thinks of his father's generation. They built this. And now he is watching it end. Not with a battle, but with a phone call. And now that empire can't last 10 days without American permission. So we stop, Eden says at last. It is not a debate. It is a verdict. Lloyd tries one final escape route. What if we go straight to the IMF around the United States? Britain needed $1.5 billion, and Washington controlled the vote. Macmillan shakes his head. They've already made it clear, no help until we withdraw. And in that moment, Britain stops being an empire in the old sense, not because its soldiers were beaten in Egypt, but because it is no longer the one making the decision. That same day, Britain announces a ceasefire, not under the threat of defeat on the battlefield, but under the threat of a graph showing dollars vanishing. 3 hours later, Eden gives a public statement. His voice falters. Months later, he resigns, officially for health. In reality, broken. In the House of Commons, the shock is open. Conservatives can't believe it. They halted the operation under pressure. Labor demands resignations. One MP shouts, "This is capitulation." He's right. For the first time in a century, Britain stops a war not because it lost, but because it could no longer afford to continue. In Paris, there is rage. Guy Mollet feels betrayed. France would draw its own conclusion, one that would reshape European defense for decades, never again depend on American decisions. In Cairo, there is celebration. Nasser appears on a balcony. The crowd roars his name. He has beaten 2 European empires, not with an army but with endurance. In Moscow, there is satisfaction. Khrushchev understands his missile bluff worked well enough to claim, "We stopped the aggressors." It isn't true, yet who, in the global noise, will check? A month later, Soviet newspapers will run a cartoon, Britain on its knees. In the same weeks, Soviet tanks crush Hungarian rebels in Budapest. There were no cartoons for that. In Washington, there is relief. Eisenhower wins the election 2 days later. The fact that he did it by breaking an ally, those are details voters never learn. Nasser stays in power until 1970. The canal remains Egyptian, permanently. This wasn't just a defeat. It was a systems signal. Britain can no longer act alone. The old world ended in a single morning. What happened at Suez did not end with a ceasefire. It rewired the system. Within months, British policy quietly changes. Global ambitions shrink. Overseas bases are reconsidered. By 1971, Britain had closed bases in Aden, Singapore, and the Persian Gulf. Over 50,000 troops were withdrawn. Defense reviews begin speaking a new language. Commitments, priorities, affordability. Words that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The phrase special relationship remains, but after Suez, its meaning is no longer ambiguous. It does not mean equality. It means alignment. For France, the conclusion is different. Paris does not accept subordination quietly. The humiliation at Suez accelerates a decision already forming. France will build its own nuclear force. It will seek autonomy. It will never again allow Washington to hold a financial veto over French strategy. Charles de Gaulle will later articulate this openly. But the seed is planted here, in 1956, when France learns that even coordinated military action means nothing if the United States controls the financial switch. For Israel, Suez becomes a cautionary lesson written in hard ink. Alliances are conditional. Support lasts only as long as interests align. Strategic independence will require more than promises. For the Arab world, the signal is electric. A former colony stood up to Europe, and Europe blinked. Not because Egypt was stronger, but because the global system had changed. Nasser becomes a symbol, not of perfect governance, not of economic success, but of defiance that worked. And symbols matter more than spreadsheets when movements begin. Across Africa and Asia, leaders are watching carefully. They don't all understand the mechanics of currency reserves and dollar liquidity, but they understand the result. Empires can be challenged, and challenged successfully. From that point on, decolonization accelerated at breakneck speed. 1957 saw Ghana become the first Black African colony to gain independence. Then came 1960, the year of Africa, when 17 countries broke free in a single year. It wasn't generosity. It was the realization that Britain could no longer enforce the old order. Behind every negotiation now sits an unspoken question: who controls the money? That question defines the second half of the 20th century. And in 1956, everyone learned the answer. The United States emerges from Suez as something new, not just a military superpower, not just an ideological leader, but the financial center of gravity. The issuer of the currency everyone needs in a crisis. The actor that doesn't have to invade, because it can simply refuse support. This is why Suez matters more than many wars with higher body counts. It is the moment power stops being measured primarily in ships and divisions, and starts being measured in reserves, credit, and confidence. That is the real legacy of Suez. The age of classical empire ended, and the new empires do not always arrive with flags. Sometimes they arrive with spreadsheets. Harold Macmillan became prime minister. Eden broke. Macmillan rose. In politics, the person who recognizes reality first is usually the one who survives. There is an irony here. Macmillan, the man who stepped over the ruins of Suez, would 5 years later deliver his famous Winds of Change speech in Africa. He would tell the world that decolonization was inevitable. He would frame it as wisdom, foresight, adaptation. But in truth, Suez had already decided the outcome. Macmillan simply learned how to describe defeat with elegant words, so it could be accepted as strategy. Eden, for the rest of his life, never truly admitted error. In his memoirs, he blamed the Americans. But the empire did not end because of betrayal. It ended because of math. Suez shattered faith in British inevitability, instantly. After that, the question was no longer whether the empire would fall, but how fast. And Suez changed more than politics. It changed the rules of financial warfare. Before 1956, many still treated currency as mainly a tool of trade. After 1956, it became obvious. Currency is a tool of power. The one who controls the reserve currency controls other countries' options. The United States learned that lesson. In the decades that followed, Washington would use this mechanism again and again, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly, because it works. And in a sense, it all begins with that call George Humphrey made in November 1956. Britain learned a different lesson. Never again act against the United States in a crisis that can turn into a currency emergency. After Suez, the special relationship became less a partnership of equals and more an insurance policy for survival. So what does this mean for today? And here is the central takeaway. Modern empires no longer fall primarily under the force of guns. They fall when they lose control of their currency, their debt, and their access to liquidity. Military force without financial sovereignty is a stage set. Even today, there are countries with armies, resources, ambitions, and debts that quietly place them under someone else's leverage. Somewhere in Washington, someone is already watching their charts. The question is, whose? 90% of people think empires fall because of wars. After this story, you know the real answer. They fall when the money runs out. This mechanism didn't retire in 1956. Right now, there's a country with missiles and oil, staring at its debt charts. And someone in Washington is watching the same charts. Next video, I'll show you who. And write in the comments. Suez. Was it betrayal of an ally or cold calculation? I'm interested in your view.